4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. If you are interested in these programs, please join our membership. The membership is also available online at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is the founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln, and he has served on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission for more than 2 decades. And he's currently also on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees. Jim's talk today is a part 2 of his talk that was last month, titled Havelock. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Don't see the same people here that we had last time. Huh? So before we started, I did a refresher of all the slides of last time. So if you missed them, too bad. Well, our first slide starts not in Havelock, but in Lincoln. This is at about 10th and Vine Streets, which would put it somewhere west of the present Coliseum. Is a good way to think about it. At that time, 10th Street, particularly to the south of this area, was kind of the Piedmont section of Lincoln, if you will. This is where the bankers and the attorneys lived and had huge houses. Today, we don't think of it quite in the same terms. But in 1916, the Heb Motor Works had 3 different factory buildings in the city of Lincoln. One was at 10th and Vine, one at 26th and X, and their offices were at 13th and P. Today, we have the Stewart Building in about that area. In 1918, the Woods Brothers, the same Woods Brothers Corporation that we still have today in Lincoln, offered to donate a tract of land if the Heb Brothers would combine their 3 factories in Havelock, Nebraska. At this time, of course, Havelock was still a separate city. They employed in the 3 factories a bit less than 300 people at that time. The Woods Brothers had taken over the city of Havelock and were selling off lots and developing new lots in the area at that time, and they predicted by 1930 the city of Havelock would have a population over 25,000. They were trying to build Havelock into an industrial suburb. So, I've lost the changer already. This is the beginning of the factory, which the Woods Brothers will help them locate in the city of Havelock. You can tell it's on the Burlington Railway trackage. And this smokestack will stand for many, many decades as kind of a beacon, and you might know where it was. In 1919, the factory was completed and they began production of vehicles. And here is a building which, if you're from Havelock, you will see as still existent, but in this case it has a dual purpose, the Heb Brothers factory and the Patriot Works in Havelock. In 1919, they began producing trucks in the building. Initially, they produced 3 different trucks. One was the Revere, one the Washington, and one the Rocky Mountain Special. They were 1 ton, 2 tons, and 2.5-ton trucks. They advertised that the top speed of these trucks was 40 miles an hour. We can't be sure it was 40 miles an hour because they didn't have speedometers, but what they did was they would time it between posts and then figure out how fast it was going. So we're pretty confident that 40 miles an hour was probably a top speed for these vehicles. Some of them were solid tire and some of them were pneumatic tires. Here we are showing a engine, probably a Ford engine being fitted on one of the solid tire vehicles, building one of the boxes in the back. This is an intriguing picture because it looks very similar, if not identical, to the truck which sits out in the lobby of the State Historical Society here. May even be this truck. We have no way of knowing, but certainly this model. In 1920, the Hebs had felt that after World War I, all of the troops that had been fighting would come home, return to the farms, and they would have been experiencing motor vehicles in all sorts and sizes, and that everybody coming back would want a truck or a tractor that was going to be gasoline powered instead of using horses, which is what they had used when they left. Much to the Hebs' surprise, everybody came home was uninterested in trucks. The truck factory is going to founder almost immediately, and in 1920, really not much more than a year after they started, the truck factory will fail. In 1921, our friends the Woods brothers will say, okay, we will buy the factory back from you for $110,000. So the Woods brothers acquired the Hebb Brothers Works and began producing trucks on their own out there. By 1930, they were making just a few trucks and basically sort of custom work only. They were doing what Hebb had done originally, and that was Hebb had a sort of Ford franchise, and they would buy those chassis, and then they would build up from them trucks, ambulances, travel vehicles, anything you wanted built on a Ford chassis. Then in 1926, I think I may be getting a little ahead of the pictures here, this is a part of a fleet which they produced for the Standard Oil Company. Most of those trucks went out to western Nebraska. This is a shot which shows Dandelion Days in Havelock, which occurred every year, and it does actually relate to the Hebbs in a minute. This is a stack of dandelions in front of the fire station in Havelock, which is still a restaurant today. Every year they would have children in the city of Havelock have a contest to see who could pick the most dandelions. I thought they were getting ready to make dandelion wine, but no. It was a contest to see who could pick the most. And one young man told me about 2 or 3 years ago that he won that contest and won a bicycle 2 or 3 times because he figured out that if he picked his dandelions very first thing in the morning, they were plump with moisture. And they weighed up more and they filled more bags. So he won it. But in fact, that was discontinued a short time later. That'll have to come back and figure in a minute. In 1926, Mark Woods, who was the son of Pace Woods Sr., who died not long ago at about the age of 100, bought the design for this airplane called the Aerosport from a man by the name of Johnny Morris, who designed it in his father's garage. They began producing this airplane in the old truck factory in Havelock, and it was an interesting production because as the airplanes were finished and went through the production line, instead of ending up as you would think they might on the ground floor, they ended up on the second floor. And we see here that they had to then be lowered down this ramp by ropes. The same thing is true, interestingly, of the Ford factory in Omaha in the Tip Top building. The Ford motor cars, when they were completely assembled, were on the top floor. Counterintuitive, but nonetheless, this is the way it worked. And here they are lowering down one of the airplanes. By 1929, so not so very many years later, the Woods Brothers Aircraft Factory in Havelock was turning out 4 airplanes per day, which doesn't in a way sound like a whole lot of airplanes, except airplanes at that time were like what would come along in the 50s, and that was the television set, where there were just hundreds of factories turning out television sets. At this time, there were many, many aircraft factories in the United States. They will later be consolidated by people like Boeing. But at that time, the Havelock production facility of the Woods Brothers at 4 airplanes per day was the largest airplane manufacturer in the world. Kind of hard to get your arms around. 29. The most popular was the Aerosport, and it sold for about $2,500. And the Hebb brothers actually at this point in time had 700 employees working for them. They had 3 basic aircraft they were producing, the Sport, the Kinner Aero, and the LeBlond 90. The Kinner Aero, if you are at the Lincoln Airport, you will see one of them hanging from the ceiling out there. That's one of those planes. Then along comes the stock market crash. And at that time, the Woods brothers were smart enough to realize that that was the end of, on the short run, of airplane sales, despite the fact that they had orders on hand for 260 airplanes that they were ready to sell. They knew that of those 260, 260 of those people would renege on the contract. So they literally stopped production. They didn't completely stop. One of the things they did was they turned the factory into a welding school, which cleverly was used to employ some of their key employees as teachers, knowing that after the Depression, a new interest in airplanes would occur and they would be able to go back into production. They wanted to keep their key employees. My uncle, as a matter of fact, was one of the students who went and became a welding student at that time. By 1931, the truck division had lost $20,000, and the aircraft division that year lost $18,000. So obviously not a good paying prospect. Between the years 1930 and 1937, instead of 4 airplanes per day, they averaged 1 airplane per month. So production literally stopped. One of the things that happened during the Great Depression was that President Roosevelt had looked back at the Volkswagen, wherein Germans had been had been promised a car in every garage, and Roosevelt decided that we needed to one-up him. He wanted to promise the American people an airplane for every home. So what he did was he challenged the aircraft industry in the United States to build and design an airplane that would cost no more than $1,000, would have at least 100 horsepower, seat at least 2 people, and be able to fly at 100 miles an hour. Good idea. Contest. 14 designs were submitted. Of the 14, not one of them fulfilled the requirements. None of them did. The Aero company submitted a design, which was a 2-seater, 100 miles per hour, called the Aero A&M. Unfortunately, the cheapest price they could sell it for was $3,495, a long ways away from what they needed. So the big prize was going to be simply a government contract, and nobody got the government contract because the prize really was ineffective. The contest didn't work. This is an aerial view of the airport. The airplanes, we're not sure exactly. We have knowledge that some of the airplanes may have been flown out of the production facility. If you're aware of the area in Havelock today, to the southwest of there, there's a fairly large, at that time, open field. Could they have been flown out of there? We think they might have been able to. Most of them were put on railroad cars and taken to Union Airport, where they were, in some cases, doped. In other words, the wings were coated with lacquer and dope, and in some cases, probably flown out of there. We can't actually, for sure, say. And this airport, we find some of those hangars are still there. It's now known as the Sias Industrial Tract. This is one of the 2 hangars that was the primary hangars. One was called the doping hangar, and the other just a hangar for storage. The doping hangar would have been very interesting because I would think it would have been a very, very difficult environment, explosive for one thing. And we know of no particular problems at that time with explosions. 1936 is going to come along, and one of the problems with getting an airplane down to $1,000, as Roosevelt had challenged, was that the parts were too expensive. However, the Woods brothers discovered, in hiring a man in Detroit to help them design a new airplane, that they could buy a 58 horsepower Ford V8 water-cooled automobile engine for $57, a fraction of what it cost to have an air-cooled regular airplane engine. So what they did was they applied for and were able to get federal permission to build an airplane around an automobile engine, and this was the first such federal government grant that was ever made and allowed them to. The plane, as you can see it, had, let's look at a picture of the plane with the Ford V8 engine in it. It's mounted backwards and geared down 2-to-1. It had a big structural design flaw, however, and that was underneath it, you can see hanging down the radiator. And this was a design flaw not because the radiator stuck out there so much, but because the engine itself was cast iron, so it was very heavy. But also you add to that the weight of the coolant, which was water and perhaps ethylene glycol or perhaps more like alcohol. This is very heavy. This made the airplane very nose heavy. But the Woods brothers were pretty smart. They said that if you're given lemons, make lemonade. And they knew this was a problem. In fact, the Ford Motor Company sent pilots in to pilot, and they said that in every case, these pilots just simply, they said it took off like a dream, flew like a dream. They said the second you touched the stick, the airplane would instantly take on what they called a rock glide path. In In other words, he wanted to go straight down because of this weight. They said it literally would scare you to death the first time you started to land a plane. And despite that, we don't really have any records of any crashes or anything else. Evidently, the pilots were all so accustomed to this and warned ahead of time that this didn't become the great problem that it might have been. They built 107 airplanes with the Ford V8 engine in it from 1936 to 1938, so not a whole lot. It was never completely successful. One of the things they did was that Ford, as I said, if you're given lemons, make lemonade, they offered a prize of $500 to any pilot who could put it into a stall. Now, my guess is, and I've talked to Lowell about this, we don't understand exactly how this would work, but think of it, if you're headed straight down, the air that as you go through it is going to keep the propeller turning. So maybe in a way you couldn't, by their definition of it, stall it. I don't know. But at any rate, we also have no records of them ever having to pay out the $500. One of the things that happened was that they would take an airplane off for every Havelock High School football game. They would take an airplane off from Union Airport, fly over Ballard Field where the football games were played. They would swoop down over the crowd and throw out the football to start the game. Today, I think there would be just the FAA would probably be having heart palpitations every time they took off, because we had this airplane that was really pretty stable, but you got to realize they're going to have to come down over the grandstand. But nonetheless, they did it. Financing is going to become their biggest problem. They're also going to face some litigation. They're also going to start trying to outsource production of airplane parts, and they got one big contract from Boeing in Seattle. And Boeing, as you probably realize, is one of those conglomerations where they're picking up smaller airplane factories and consolidating them for the first time. And they give a large contract to the Woods Brothers to manufacture some part for airplanes. And the Woods Brothers went to the East Coast, got financing for it, got most of the tooling ready to go, and Boeing reneged on the contract. This was a tremendous financial blow. And what Boeing's excuse was, they said that they could see a great deal of trouble in transporting the parts and damage transporting them to the West Coast. So that did not work. Then in 1941, they finally closed aircraft production in Havelock. So it had gone on from literally the late 20s to 1941 with interruptions for the Great Depression. 1943, that building, and that picture purports to be of the last flying Ford V8. However, at that time we knew of two of them, and I don't know, there may still be some flying, we're not sure, maybe one. This is a picture of General Pershing with the cane and Pace Woods, Sr., standing to his left, and a pilot in front of one of their airplanes. We have no idea why the picture was taken, and we are pretty sure that General Pershing never set foot in one of the airplanes. Too smart for that, maybe. 1941, it closed 1943. It was acquired first by lease by the Goodyear Corporation. Primarily, they said they were going to manufacture leak-proof gasoline tanks and store B-17 parts. And there is some indication now that there were parts of many bombers actually manufactured in this plant. Remains to be proven, but we seem to have pretty good track of it. An aerial view of that plant, and we can begin to see, too, in this picture that there were great areas around it that were not peopled, housed, or building occupied. And, of course, this building still is there, and although it's no longer Goodyear, they still do manufacture some of the Goodyear products, V-belts, I think, and maybe hoses. So it wasn't the hoped for, but it did bring economic gain to the city. We're back down in the city of Havelock now. This is the Johnson Hotel. And we talked last time, I think, a smidgen about the Vicarage, which sits on the northwest corner of Havelock Avenue there. This hotel was a full-service hotel. It was one of about 3 or 4 hotels in the city. This was directly to the north on the same half block as the Vicarage. And it was a hotel which had a restaurant in it, for example, rooms for traveling salesmen, and display rooms and so forth. Much larger than it looked. Some of you, including me, may remember that hotel as it stood back there as an apartment house, which was probably torn down in the early 1960s, and it is now, of course, a parking lot for the Vicarage. This is the Schmidt Garage. Minty Schmidt built this building in 1916. It was a Ford garage. It is catty corner from the present Joyo Theater. This building was a Ford garage. You can see on the right-hand side it talks about Fords. And where now there is a sign that says Roper's Mortuary, the Ford garage was actually on the lower level, and you went down a ramp into there. The door directly in front of this car on the left-hand side was the entrance to the Farmers and Mechanics Bank. To the left, the area with the awnings was the U.S. Post Office. This would be the second site of the U.S. Post Office. We saw the last site last month. On the corner were doctors' offices, including my favorite dentist right in there. And the second floor, as now, was all apartments. Now, in 1920s, and even a little bit before that, we talked about the fact last time that there were a tremendous number of Burlington Railroad trains going through, and with the Rock Island, they said there was a train crossing Havelock Avenue about every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day. So you can imagine if you're in a car trying to cross the tracks, it would be a major stumbling block. So finally, in 1937, they decided to build a area under a viaduct so the trains will go across over the top. This is Havelock Avenue running towards the east as we're looking at it. And of course, as soon as they built it, the unforeseen, perhaps good thing was that it filled with water. They did not figure out a way to get it adequately cleaned out, and this was a problem which was exacerbated until probably, the 1990s, when they quadrupled the size of the underpass, which meant that it held 4 times as much water. And here we see them, they've stocked it with fish. So this is lovely Lake Havelock, and this truck is obviously stalled down there. Today, I think they've got it pretty well figured out how to pump the water out of there, and we don't see much of that in evidence at all anymore. This is one of the areas which contains 2 different types of houses. Some of these houses were built by my great uncle, who was a contractor in the area, and he produced what he called workmen's cottages. But the other thing is we find that about 200 houses were actually moved from West Lincoln. And West Lincoln, which had been a tremendously successful but very, very briefly as a growing town, but with a couple of things happening, the Depression of 1893, and a subsequent depression, and primarily with West Lincoln's losing their source of clear water, they started pumping nothing but salt water out there. And up until that time, it had been a major facility for livestock, canning, soapworks, brickworks, and so on and so forth. West Lincoln was just absolutely booming, but with the loss of fresh water, the town literally died, and they moved about 200 houses out of West Lincoln, many of them to Havelock, as it became more popular around the various industries, including primarily the Burlington Railroad. These little buildings, there are probably 50, 75 of them still left. They're very, very tiny. I don't think that any of them still stands without an addition or 2 on them. You can hardly find them. Most of them will be on the north side of Havelock Avenue. And this area was north of Havelock Avenue, and for the most part just to the east of Tuzlan, in that kind of quadrant. You'll still find them scattered around. I asked my uncle, who worked for my great uncle for a while, these little houses, how did they come about? Did they have a plan? And he said, well, what they did was they would accumulate lumber. As soon as they had enough lumber, they would just build a house. They didn't have an architect. They just built the house. This is Ballard Avenue today. It was known as Indiana Avenue, and for a long time it was N Street, because Havelock will see Lincoln's system of street numbering and lettering, and they will replicate it. The middle street, O Street, we now call Havelock Avenue. So ABC, and of course when they came into the city of Lincoln in the early 30s, they had to give up that system, because as particularly streets running north and south ran into Havelock, they had to adapt the street numbering system of Lincoln. And all of the streets, with save one, were renamed at that time. Tuzlan kept the name Tuzlan. And as I said, Indiana became Ballard, for example. This is the original site of the Joyo Theater by the name Joyo. It's on the south side of Havelock Avenue. There were theaters in Havelock before this. One of the buildings still exists towards the east on the north side. There were also films being shown in Havelock well before they were in Lincoln, and they simply did what some of the little towns were going to do clear into the 50s and 60s, and that is they would drop a sheet over the edge of a building, and in the evening they would project movies onto those, and people could sit on benches and so forth. But this is the first building that was really an indoor theater. It was built in 1910 as a saloon, and the building we're looking at in the middle, you can see hanging from the top, there's some light bulbs, and that's the only thing in its entrance that lets you know that this was the original Joyo Theater. The saloon is gone. Then, across the street, my great-uncle, another great-uncle, will build this theater, which was the Lyric Theater. He will build it in 1928. That was Volney Hedrick. My great-uncles had great names. Alney, Volney, Roy. You don't find names like that much anymore. And my great-aunts, my grandmother's name was Laura, and her sisters were Lena and Lottie. So, names that have sort of faded. So, we threatened my daughter. We named her after my grandmother, Laura. And if she wasn't doing something just right, I said, now remember, we can always change your name to Lena or Lottie. And that always, she shaped up instantly. It's great. So anyway, Volney will build this building, 6102 Havelock Avenue, and if it looks familiar, it's because they're going to close the Joyo on the south side and move the Joyo into the theater in 1928 roughly, a little after that, maybe 30s, and change the name to the Joyo. So it is the Joyo Theater that you see today. 1936 it sold for the first time, and of course now it has new owners again. It's the only theater in Lincoln, I think, other than the Ross, that's not owned by the Marcus chain. So if you want to go to a movie theater, one, not owned by a chain, you can go to Havelock. And the neat thing about that theater is very, very little about the insides has changed. If you walk in, your feet will still stick on the same Coke residue that was there when I was a kid. Not much has changed. This is, as it is, the Joyo, and that's Slim, who was one of the later owners, changing the sign. It's air-conditioned, which was a great advantage in that lot. And down below it was the barber shop, Golden's Barbers. This is where I went to get my hair cut. We would drive to Havelock where I could get my hair cut for 15 cents. Now it's $15. The owner, Mr. Golden, was a barber, but he very, very rarely, if ever, cut anybody's hair. There he is on the left, standing in the barber shop. The barber shop had a checkered career during Prohibition. At least the tales about it were that this is where the imported goods came in and were redistributed, if you follow me. Later, Mr. Golden was the cigarette tax treasurer for the state of Nebraska. Was he county clerk or county treasurer? I can't remember which. County treasurer. And always running for something. When I was a little kid, 5 or 6 years old, he would come up and shake my hand and say, "Frank Golden," and smile. Someday he knew I'd get my vote for something. Kind of guy. Now this is Dr. Ballard. Dr. Ballard will be the first mayor, if you will, of the city of Havelock. He was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, 1856, came first to Fillmore County in 1871, and came to Havelock in 1892, which was a good year to come to Havelock because in 1893 it was incorporated as a city. So he became the first mayor of the city, although at that time he wasn't called the mayor, but it was, in fact, he was the mayor. He was a physician. He was the official physician for the Burlington Railroad, a very remunerative position. His father served 2 terms in the Nebraska legislature, so his family was well thought of. His house still stands, and I think we'll see a picture of it in a minute, on Ballard Avenue. The city park was partly given to the city of Havelock by Dr. Ballard. This shows the bandstand, and it would be, the best way to tell you where it was is where it still is, and this would be directly across the street and a little bit to the south from Misty's. And this library building was in 1906, built on the corner of the park on, again, land given by Dr. Ballard. It stood right on the alley. It faced towards the west, again, in the city park. It was built in '06. Mr. Carnegie gave $6,000 to build the building. He was approached a couple times and ultimately could see the need for a library there. Part of the money to build it was given by Dr. Ballard, part of it by the Havelock Land Company, which was, for all intents and purposes, going to become the Woods Brothers. Block 30, 2 different lots were set aside. In 1907, they approached Mr. Carnegie, who popped another $1,000 to put in a furnace, which seems like a good guy. The way Carnegie libraries worked was you would apply and tell him why you thought you deserved a library. You would submit plans. Although an awful lot of them look alike, they didn't have to be to this plan or any particular plan. If you look around Nebraska, there are dozens of different designs. He liked this plan, and he had to approve the plan. You also had to have a city ordinance in place so that if he gave money to build a library, he could be assured that the library would continue in existence. Secondly, the city had to buy the books. Thirdly, the city had to buy the furniture. Well, of the $1,000 that was given, Mr. Carnegie also gave part of that money, not for the furnace, but for furniture as well. And it's interesting now to look back at Lincoln, who has lost their downtown library to fire about the same time, and they go in under the same plan. You furnish the land, and he will put up roughly 50% of the money to build the library. Unfortunately, the city of Lincoln was not able to immediately raise their 50%. They had to go back to Mr. Carnegie and ask for 50% of the remaining 50%. They went back to Mr. Carnegie to get more money for shelving. They went back to Mr. Carnegie to get more money for books. So this becomes a sort of point of contention a little bit later on when Havelock is able to raise the funds and the city of Lincoln cannot. The library was closed in 1971 and torn down, and you can imagine that was pretty popular in Havelock. So the city immediately reacted by building Anderson Branch, which is, of course, much, much larger of a library. This is the Havelock football team, the high school team. Now, one of the things that they noted instantly was that in Havelock being an industrial community, most of the people in Havelock, the men, were shift workers at the Burlington. That was the largest employer, obviously, in the city. And everybody, as we noticed last time, if they didn't work for the Burlington, they were still reliant on the Burlington. So many of the fathers were never able to see their sons play football. And one of the things that was brought up by the local Lions Club and the business community in Havelock was, why don't we put electric lights on our football field so that they can play their games instead of the middle of the afternoon on Friday? They can play them in the evening when more shift workers will not be working and will be able to watch their sons play football. Great idea. So they got together. Dr. Ballard, again, gives land for the football field. This is today where the Ballard swimming pool and the Ballard softball fields are. So it's not Ballard Park. Well, I guess they call it Ballard Park and the other one Havelock Park. So this is where they're going to build a football field with electric lights. They will put up bleachers and electric lights. We see here, this picture is the first game played under electric lights. The first game really was kind of a demonstration game. October the 9th, 1929. They played, their team was called the Engineers, and they played Teachers College High School. Okay? Havelock High School squeaked by 31-0. Okay? Now, my uncle is in this picture. He was one of the football players, and it rose, in my mind, more questions arose than answers. My first question was, why is the field white? And my immediate thought was that they had covered the entire field with quicklime, like you would make the stripes and so forth on, in order that the lights would reflect up and make the field lit. He said, well, you first of all have to realize that this was an experiment. We didn't know what we were doing, and no, it wasn't quicklime, it's sawdust. They spent wood chips and sawdust over the whole field in the hopes of making it all weather. He said what it did was that the sawdust and those chips mixed with the dirt, and when it dried out, it made concrete, which isn't too good. He said, but we had these huge 40,000 candle power lights up here on 10-foot poles. The stands would seat over 1,000 people. He said, but what they didn't realize at the time was that they had the first lighted football field west of the Missouri River, the third lighted high school football field in the United States. So they were experimenting with things like how to light the field. And he said the most interesting experiment in his mind was, should the ball be black? Should the ball be white? Because they were afraid that if they looked up into these lights, the football would disappear. So they experimented with black footballs and footballs. And he said after a time they finally figured it out, and the football was black with a white spiral around it. And they thought, that's going to be the answer, that's what everybody will start using. Well, obviously that didn't work at all. The stands were so popular that they had to increase the size of the field's stands double within just a year. Very, very popular. It was not very, very popular, however, with other visiting football teams. The city of Lincoln High School, for example, refused to play football at Havelock. The coach, whose name was Brown, with an E on the end of it, had several good excuses. One, he said, the night air is not good for the boys. Now, if you speak Havelockian, you realize what this translates to. It means Lincoln High School was scared spitless of Havelock. They were afraid to play them. That's my interpretation. But at any rate, and the Lincoln Public Schools later on will say Havelock must cease playing at night in lights. Not to be done, not to be done. Well, in October, let's look at the next picture. In 1930, this is at Lincoln High School. And in 1930, roughly the same time period that Havelock is building a lighted football stadium, Lincoln High School is building the Oval, which is also gone, sadly. It featured a half-mile track and a football field with sod exclamation point. This was apparently a big deal at the time. It was actually larger than the university's track, so the track team from the University of Nebraska would come over and practice sometimes at the Oval. They had stands which they said would seat 4,000 people, so pretty good sized deal. The interesting thing about it was built for $21,000, but the city of Lincoln did not pay a dime of that. The students at Lincoln High School went to the Stewart Investment Company, and the Stewart Investment Company put the money forward with the guarantee from 40 Lincoln businessmen, each guaranteeing $20,000 of the loan. So the students paid off the field completely. There was not one dime of taxpayer money involved in it. And that's interesting, too, because it was the only high school facility, they said, in the world, but at least in the United States, that was paid for without 1 cent of tax dollars going to it. So they're very, very proud of their football field. For one reason, Havelock is very, very proud of their other one. At this time, Lincoln High School had one big problem. They had 2,200 students in the entire school, which included, of course, more than high school at that time. But 16 of those students had cars. And they could see that with 16 students and 2 faculty members with cars, parking was going to become a problem. Yeah. Were they right? I guess they were. Okay. Going to skip around here. This is the construction of the Safeway store, which is now Misty's. And we're looking towards the north, and the hotel back there is the Holliott House Hotel, which last time we saw was operated by my great-grandfather on the other side, and that's where that wire went from the roof down to the telephone pole with the person with the pulley in their teeth. They were up from the top of that building. And that's a Safeway store in completion. And it's still there. This is the Havelock Businessmen's Association, and they are the ones that underwrote and guaranteed the production of the high school field there in Havelock. This is Vic Anderson, Havelock's favorite son, who will become the governor of the state of Nebraska. The people in Havelock, you are never a hero to your own valet. You've probably heard that. But wags in Havelock, some of them didn't think so much of Vic Anderson for some reason, really. His father owned the hardware store. And they took this picture, which he was using for a campaign to run for governor, and underneath it they put by the way, Vic is on the right, they put underneath it the caption, now what did you say this was for again? This is the city council the night before the election as to whether the city of Havelock would be annexed. They had taken a straw vote in 1929, should Havelock annex itself to the city of Lincoln. And I think we talked last time about the fact that the city of Lincoln really wanted Havelock because Havelock had a great tax base because of the industry. They really wanted it. Havelock High School, when it was completed, also had more programs in many areas than did Lincoln High School, including the sciences and home ec and so forth. So they were desirous of the city for its tax base and for its high school as well. So in the 1929s, they took a straw vote, and it was an overwhelming vote not to be annexed. Havelock could see no reason to be annexed. They had their own telephone company, sewer, gas production facilities, a good tax base, great schools. Their schools were thought of positively all over the United States. So they could think of no reason for it. Well, the city of Lincoln, for about a year, puts on an intensive campaign. Now, at this point in time, if you wanted to be annexed, your citizenry had to vote to be annexed. And after you voted to be annexed, then the city that you were to be annexed to had to also vote to facilitate the annexation. Now, the legislature's changed that now. Now, if your metropolitan city grows up against the edge of a smaller community, you may annex it without a vote of, and they're proving that in Omaha and Elkhorn, and they've done it in previous areas too. They simply will take it. So at that time it was a little more difficult. Then they have another vote in 1930. And that vote, with the city of Lincoln's proposals, passes. Now, the city of Lincoln has promised the people of Havelock that their taxes will be lower, their telephone rates will be lower, which how does a city promise you lower telephone rates? Well, unimportant. They promise that you'll have better fire protection, better police protection. Everything will be better because Mother Lincoln will take care of you. So, in October of 1930, a vote is taken of the people in Havelock, and it passes. This is a photograph of the city council the night of the election. And as you can see, they're not too happy because they are going to be out of a job. Well, what happened with annexation was not what they were promised. First of all, their school was taken over by the Lincoln Public Schools, who, as they annexed other schools like University Place and Bethany, the first thing Lincoln High did was they went into that school and they took what they felt were the best teachers and took them down to Lincoln High. The park department in Havelock becomes part of the Lincoln Park Department. The library becomes part of the Lincoln Library System. The fire department becomes part of the Lincoln Fire Department. The police department becomes part of the Lincoln Police Department. All the records of Havelock all go to the city of Lincoln. One of the things that happened was within literally hours, very, very short period of time, days, the lights on Ballard Field become the property of the Lincoln Park Department. Trucks arrive and take down the lights from Ballard Field, move them to Lincoln, most of them to the tennis courts, which were on South Street, and the rest of them to the Oval. Now, my grandfather said if they had taken another vote the next day, there would not have been one single vote to annex. This really got them. And as time progressed, everything that they had been promised was reneged on. The police department, for example, Havelock, as you know, had saloons. And the city of Lincoln said, if you're going to have a saloon, you have to have a policeman on the beat. But the city of Lincoln would not furnish a policeman on the beat. So the old city council got together, and they and the business community hired off-duty Lincoln policemen to become the policemen on the beat in Havelock. Everything is going to go down the hill. The fire engine, which had been built by the Heb as a chain-driven fire engine and given to the city of Havelock, was of course taken by the city of Lincoln. Everything went away. And as I said, the Lincoln Board of Education ordered Havelock to cease playing night football. Objections were raised from Havelock. The city of council said, no more night football. The telephone rates, instead of being lowered, were increased. Everything happened. And streetcars were taken away as well. So, one of the things that the city of Havelock did was they continued for a time, not to date, but they continued for a time to have mock elections. And they would elect a mock city council and a mock mayor of the city of Havelock. And Bob Sikota, who had Mr. B. Bryant Air Conditioning, was the last mock mayor that I know of. There may have been subsequent ones. This is the 1967 re-election, if you will, of city councilmen, and includes a lot of people who we've talked about already. And I don't think they do that anymore either. A picture now of an aerial view of Havelock in the distance. The street down below here is 48th Street, and the highway and the straight line right up there is the Burlington. And the curving one to the right is the Rock Island Railroad. And you'll see that there's a spur that curves off to the left towards the Goodyear plant, the Heb Brothers Motor, and the Woods Brothers. Interesting things in this picture were, of course, 48th Street was technically, at this point, the western boundary of Havelock. We don't think of it as today that. But clear in the lower right-hand corner, where today there's a fiberglass plant, this was Good's Ice House, an ice plant. And Good's, W.T. Good's daughter, was a young lady by the name of Mignonette Good. She will drop the et and become Minion Good. She will then marry an engineer whose name was Eberhardt, and she will become Minion Good Eberhardt, who during her tenure as a mystery writer, there were a couple years in there where she was selling more books than Agatha Christie was. Her books, her mystery books, are all still in print. I won't say they stand the test of time very well, but they're still in print. Mr. Good had two ice ponds that are visible in this picture, one in the lower right and one up here on the left. And so in the wintertime, when they weren't manufacturing ice, they would just cut ice off of those ponds as well. Havelock, in a way, hasn't changed very much at all. This is the street in front of the Joyo Theater, looking towards the west. The buildings that we talked about are almost all still there. There are a couple of newer buildings in there. This is the north side of the street. The Joyo is the old Lyric, for example, and they now have a new marquee on that building. But other than that, you could say this picture was taken a short time ago with an old car in it. Across the street, the other side of the street, we have parallel parking at this point in time. One of the things that had happened along about 1958 was that the city of Havelock looked out towards the east side of Lincoln and saw something happening. They saw a shopping center being built, and it was Gateway Shopping Center. And the business community again got together and said, you know, what we've got here is a shopping center. All we need to do is figure out a way to bring them together so that it can be shopped without being out in the weather, for example. So what they did was they devised a plan to build awnings. These would be steel awnings or metal awnings that would run the buildings down to the edge of the street along both sides of Havelock Avenue through the entire business district. So they then invited Doug Brogdon, who was the city planning director at that time, the mayor of the city of Lincoln, and other city officials out to Havelock to a meeting where they were going to introduce this plan to make Havelock the Havelock Shopping Center. They produced the plan, showed it, and immediately the city of Lincoln stood up and said, "You can't do that. It will not meet city codes." And literally at that point in time, the de facto, the pretend mayor of Havelock invited the mayor of the city of Lincoln, the planning director, and all his employees to get out of Havelock and not, thank you, ever come back. Well, they didn't get the awning built, of course. Nothing happened. Much about the avenue stays the same. We can see some of the buildings we talked about last time, the little white building in there, just this side of it where it has a restaurant named Norma's. That's the old Farmers and Mechanics Bank building, for example. All of the other buildings are still there. One thing has changed in Havelock. This is the California Lunch, which stood directly across the street from the Burlington Shops and went up shortly after the turn of the century and was operated by a man and his wife and subsequently their daughter as a lunchroom, and also they sold supplies and things to the men who worked at the Burlington Shops. Also, supposedly, and we have no way of proving this, if you went into this building up until about 3 or 4 years ago, they would show you the stool where Charles Lindbergh sat. And of course, he would have gone out to fly out at Union Airport. So it's a possibility, but who knows whether it is or not. And about 2 years ago, the daughter passed away, and what was obviously started as a house is once again a house. So a few things about Havelock have changed. My grandfather, who died in the 1980s, for example, never once went downtown. He went over to Lincoln. And this still exists today. Havelock, of all of the suburbs, is still more autonomous and still thinks more of themselves as a separate city than any of the others do. A good portion of that is due to the fact that they still have a business community, but more important than that, I think, is that Havelock has not been completely grown around by the city of Lincoln. So you go east of Havelock and north of Havelock, it's still pretty much the edge of the world. But nonetheless, Havelock, people still think about themselves as a separate community. And that, with this slide, another one of them found in the basement of Mr. Baker's drugstore when he closed, closes our program on Havelock, and we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I don't know how much, but we do have time for questions if there are any. So, if you have a question, jump in. Right.
Why did they have to tear down the Havelock Library, whereas College View, Union, United Place, and the Northeast?
This was and I will repeat the question so that it gets on the air. And the question was, why did they have to tear down the Havelock Library? And believe me, if you'd asked the people in Havelock that question, you would have gotten 100% negative votes too. We don't know. There was the city library board that decided to tear it down and be done with it. It was very tiny. It was probably the smallest of the 3 libraries, even maybe smaller or about the same size as the Northeast Branch, which was moved out on 27th Street and has now been built around as a, there's soup kitchen or something sort of thing around it. I can't think of the name of it. Matt Talbot Kitchens, right. This may have been a little bit smaller, and apparently they didn't think it could be used for anything else. And it was at a time when we did tear down buildings, for sure. And of course, we then closed Havelock's grade school, which had been Havelock High School and Havelock Junior High School, which also brought great negative comments from the community, but not enough to, there wasn't anything they could do about it. So the city of Lincoln simply impressed their will on the citizenry. Yes, Jim?
You observed that the Safeway building is still standing, but you didn't say what's there.
I didn't, did I? Well, interestingly enough, where the Safeway building stood, over in the corner of their parking lot, which would have been on the alley to the southeast of the Safeway building, a man, give me his name, John.
Bob Milton.
Bob Milton, started a tiny little restaurant in what had been a blacksmith shop, probably not more than 10 by 10 or 10 by 12, one-story tall concrete blocks. Mr. Milton started a little restaurant in there. I think it had 2 tables. I'm not sure. And I don't know what the name was initially, but very quickly it became known as Misty's. Then there was a disastrous fire in his kitchen. Maybe, who knows? He was then able to go in and buy the old Safeway building and turn it into Misty's. Now Misty's has been added on to in virtually every direction except up. But the old Safeway store is still in there, and it's still Misty's. Now Misty's has 3 locations in Lincoln, but Mr. Milton has passed from the scene here, 10 years ago or so? Something like that. So the old Safeway store is now Misty's. Yeah. Another question? Yeah.
How many different Havelock buildings were on the current block? Is there 4 buildings or 5?
Now, which block are you talking about?
Where the two school buildings are currently? I know there were 2.
Well, originally there was 1 school building there. And then there was a high school and a grade school building. And now we have the second high school building, which was 1916 to 1917, 18 is when it was built. It still stands. It was the Goodyear Recreation Center, but I think it too has a new name now, but it is still a recreation center. So there, at one point in time, there were 2 school buildings on that lot, high school and grade school. Okay? Okay, yeah, man.
Can you talk a little bit about the First National Bank of Havelock and
Well, I could talk a little bit about it. Matt knows more about it than I do, probably, but the bank he's thinking of is located where, it's now Pinnacle Bank, isn't it? Is that what the name of it is?
Yeah.
Okay. This had several incarnations, Havelock National, First National. Vic Anderson was part of that bank at one time. His father was part of that bank at one time. And this is one of the banks, and the only one in Havelock, if I'm not mistaken, that actually issued its own national banknotes during that period. Where Matt is going with this question is, and I will interpret for him, and then you can jump in, because as I said, Matt knows more about the story parts of it than I do. Banks were allowed to issue notes with their name on them, mostly 10s and 20s, but sometimes other denominations too. They looked like a U.S. bank, and they were a U.S. banknote, but they had the banks. This comes before the Federal Reserve System comes along. And the Havelock Bank did issue its own notes. And when my grandfather died in the 1970s, I guess, maybe early 80s, I can't remember the date, in his safety deposit vault, we found a number of $10 bills. And I can't remember how many there were. Do you remember?
I think 18.
18 of them, and they were all crisp uncirculated, and all in sequential order. And I knew that, there were people that collected such things. And so I immediately, for my grandmother got some of them, my uncle got some of them, and my aunt got some of them. They were divided up in the family. My mother got some of them. So they were sort of spread around. Everybody that was of that generation got one. Then my grandmother got the rest of them. And my grandmother, not being a wealthy woman, I offered to help her sell them. And I put one of them up for sale. And when I put it up for sale, it sold within seconds. I mean, it was just blindingly fast. So I quickly, the second one, moved it, doubled its price. Same thing. I doubled it again. And discovered, after the fact, sometime, how many do you suppose there were that were extant after the...
Before these ones were found, there were maybe 1 or 2.
Yeah, 1 or 2. Literally, my grandfather had in his safe deposit box, literally all of them. So that concludes our program. We will come back in a minute with more questions, though, and that concludes our program.